In this video, we'll explore two more portions of the Genesis 1 through 11 section, concentrating on the family of Adam, which principally occupies chapters 2, 3, and 4, and then the family of Noah, which principally occupies chapters 5 through 10. Here's an overview then of components within this portion regarding Adam's family, chapter 2:4 through the first verse of chapter 5. We see here that in the Garden of Eden, there is permission given by God, but also certain limits. Also within the Garden of Eden is when we find the creation of Eve, womankind designated as a helper suitable or corresponding to Adam, to the male figure. Disobedience and expulsion also emerge within this account. That will be the eating from the tree that was forbidden. Then expansion of evil as fratricide, the first murder of a brother, takes place. The Cain and Abel account in chapter 4. And this vector keeps soaring as we come to the account of Lamech right towards the end of chapter 4. We'll return to enlarge on that a bit later. For an overview of the chapters devoted to Noah's family, we see in the beginning, chapter 5. This provides a bridge from the account of Adam's family to focusing in on the family of Noah. We meet, first of all, Seth, who is indicated to be a replacement, in a sense, for Abel, who was killed by his brother Cain. And there's a bit of good news at that point as people begin to call out on God to invoke him in the time frame of Seth. And then chapter 5 moves fairly directly into genealogies, showing us succession of individuals, which ramps up and paves the way for Noah to appear. That's the reason for suggesting we consider chapter 5 as part of the larger Noah family stories. When we reach the early verses of chapter 6, we're confronted with the fact that evil has gone to seed. Humankind's inclination to engage in evil behavior, harmful behavior, has just gone ballistic. As a result, God has determined to cancel creation, except for the fact that there is an individual by the name of Noah who is behaving against the culture around him, instead following God's way. And so, with chapter 6, verse 9, God zeroes in on this one individual who will be a rescuer of the human race, a preserver of the human race, and God gives him some instructions. These instructions have to do with building the ark, a place of safety during the flood. From verse 6 of chapter 7, then, we begin the account of the flood, and that continues on through chapter 8. Once the flood is concluded, then, we come to chapter 9, and again there are instructions provided to Noah. Together with them, a covenant not only with Noah, but actually with all creatures, consisting of a promise by God not to reuse the flood. The Noah material continues with a brief episode chronicling disrespect by Ham that then brings a curse down on a descendant of his. Chapter 10 shows us the expansion of humankind from just Noah's family moving out into nations, and that will pave the way for the events of chapter 11, which we'll deal with in a later lecture. Chapter 11 is the Tower of Babel situation. Chapter 10, incidentally, sometimes is called the Table of Nations. All right, having concluded that overview of chapters 2 through 10 in Genesis, let's take up the thread of literary context, and after that, we'll look at historical context and theological, as we've done in the past. First, literary context. I'm struck initially with connectedness through these chapters. We want to be careful against excessive segmentation of them, for that would prevent us from seeing the overall stream of the plot and message. When we enter chapter 2, particularly about verse 4 or 5, we know that we're moving into a different segment, because chapter 1 had the day by day segmentation, the serialized presentation of creation, and that is not the case with the account of creation in chapter 2. So we have a different style. We also have a different setting. We're rapidly introduced to the Garden of Eden, and that's not a feature that we see in chapter 1. We're also introduced fairly early on, right within chapter 2, to the fact that there are two trees, one of which is known as the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And although humankind is encouraged to eat freely of useful fruit throughout the garden, that one tree is prohibited. That tree then figures importantly in chapter 3. So we want to realize that chapter 2 and chapter 3 are closely connected. Another element of continuity or connectedness has to do with the escalation of evil. Initially, disobedience within the garden, chapter 3, then fratricide, chapter 4, the account of Lamech, towards the end of chapter 4, and then finally, just coming to the edge of the flood, we see that evil has gone exponential. Another element of connectedness has to do with the fact that creation is reset at the flood. So there's an acknowledgement of prior creation, and now it becomes reset or restarted after the flood. Let's look first of all at an expansion on this notion of escalation of evil, and then we'll look more closely at the reset of creation. Here's the way that evil expanded. I'll just give you a moment to look these over. Now, regarding Lamech in particular, let's take a closer look at this. This excerpt comes from Genesis 4:23 to 24. And so Lamech summarizes a case of killing. He has just killed someone, and he summarizes it with this poetry and says, Ada and Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. What is helpful to observe here is that on the surface, while it appears to be a case of self-defense, that is, look, I'm justified in having responded violently to this individual because he was the first one to hurt me and I was preserving my life. It might appear that way, but scholars encourage us to look a little more deeply and consider, may this not actually be a case of violent, undeserved overreaction on the part of Lamech? In other words, he was merely wounded by this other fellow, and yet he responds with murder. So an excessive, over-the-top response, and frankly, the fact that he's singing about it and claiming that he's justified in doing it, it sounds like he's proud of it. So probably this episode is intended to express to us that evil is going exponential beyond the initial fratricide, as bad as that was, between Cain and Abel. Earlier in this chapter, it's getting even worse. In this slide, we'll look at this idea that there's continuity within these chapters surrounding the idea of a resetting of creation. The idea here is that when we come to the flood account, we shouldn't see it as disconnected from creation, but rather a reversion, a losing what was gained in creation. So, for example, creation began, as we see in the first of it, frankly, in Genesis 1. We don't get this in 2, but this is connecting us back to Genesis 1. We see watery chaos, and God is not thwarted by that, but he is able to bring out of that beautiful, orderly, exquisite creation. Well, when the flood comes, there's a reversion, a returning to watery chaos. It's not named that, but it seems fairly plain that the ancient reader would have seen that connection, and we should as well. In the first account of creation, we're told that God's Spirit hovered over the waters, and that's the first inclination that good is going to come out of this chaos. When we come to chapter 8, as the rains of the flood have stopped, we find that in chapter 8, verse 1, God sends forth a wind. As it happens, the word used here for wind, ruach, is the same word used to designate his Spirit earlier in chapter 1. Next, dry ground begins to appear, thanks to the effect of the wind in this case. In the first account of creation, one of the stages of development was exposing dry ground, so that would be a habitable region for certain animals. After the ground is sufficiently dry, then the animals are sent out. And I'm struck by the use of this particular Hebrew verb, yatzah, to ask someone to go out or something to go out. It's related to the verb that's used back in chapter 1 when God arranges for animals to come forth from the earth. Just as in chapter 1, we found the initiation of the human race from a single couple, and now after the flood, the human race is perpetuated through a single couple together with their adult children and spouses that have been preserved in the ark. Another point of continuity in this reset of creation are the sort of instructions that are given to Noah in chapter 9 after the flood. Be fruitful and multiply is the one that we see echoing the instruction found earlier in the first account of creation. And now to Noah there are some additional instructions as well concerning the sanctity of human life. So we want to detect this unmistakable connectedness of the flood account with the creation account. As we continue our study of literary context, we want to be aware of certain words and the way they have been used. Lexicography is the work of studying the meaning of a word. And here's one that I found interesting. It has to do with the name of the garden that's used there in chapter 2, verse 8, Eden, Eden in Hebrew. It seems to have the connotation of delight, or in the Ugaritic, a cognate language, cognate to Hebrew, it has the idea of moisten. So as we look back on the garden itself, the fact that it was such a delightful place, the fact that it was outfitted with moisture, essential for maintaining a beautiful garden, it's interesting to see that the name itself may have held these connotations. Assonance is another feature. You may be aware that the word for humankind and also the name of the first male, Adam, those are the same, that this closely resembles the Hebrew word for dust, being created out of dust, that is Adamah, Adam and Adamah. Also, it's interesting to be aware in Hebrew of the close connection between the word for man and woman. And here we're referring to the Hebrew word ish for man and isha for woman. Very close relationship. Next, consider an intriguing use of assonance, that is, selection of words that have a similar sound but different meaning in order to form a connection. The Hebrew sounds are arumim, which is the word describing Adam and Eve at the end of chapter 2 as being naked, together with the trait of unashamed, describing the pristine character of their marriage. And then the Hebrew word arum, which means crafty, and this describes the serpent as he is first introduced at the beginning of chapter 3. And then later in chapter 3, we encounter the word cursed, arur. We want to be careful not to intermix the meanings of these. That is to say, we do not want by similarity of sound to make the mistake of thinking that nakedness is somehow crafty or cursed. That's not it. These are different words. But the original audience, when they heard the beauty of the first marriage, arumim, naked and unashamed, and then quickly encountered the fact that the serpent was arum, crafty, this would have marked in their minds, at least subconsciously, a 180-degree turn, pivoting on a similar sound, which makes it all the more deft, clever, and in this case, hazardous. Similarly, moving to arur, cursed, that just continues that sound sequence and leaves us with the consequences of the persons who were naked and unashamed, in good condition there, in the pristine quality of marriage first created, who succumbed to the craftiness and as a result themselves became engaged in the effects of their sin, with curse resting upon them. Continuing with our study of literary context, again, we're just selecting small bits that operate within this span of chapters. Repetition is something we want routinely to be aware of. The fact that we've already connected elements of the spirit wind occurring in chapter 1 and 8, that was an example of repetition. The fact that we have the command to be fruitful and multiply a couple of times in chapters 8 and 9, reaching back even to chapter 1. This is an element of repetition. And now assonance returning, and here we're concentrating on the later portion, the Noah account. When we come to this particular verse in the instructions given to Noah after the flood, we find this instruction: whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God has God created man. Here's how it sounds in Hebrew. Shofek dam ha'adam ba'adam damo ishfek. The dam syllable repeats so many times in the font that's presented as bold, and then the similarity of sound shofek and ishfek, and that's the notion of shedding. You can connect the words, at least the bold portions, with the English translation and get a sense of how similar sounds are recycled for a compounded effect. As we come to the close of the literary aspects of this study, this particular display may help us consider the notion of genre. As we move from Noah's family up to the background of Abram, and that is taking us all the way through Genesis 11, genre is an important question to ask. First off, is it poetry or is it prose? Well, quite quickly we can recognize that this is prose. Admittedly, there are little pieces of poetry in there, such as Lamech, the Song of Lamech, and even that instruction not to shed human blood. There in chapter 9, the accountability for it. Those are bits of poetry, but by and large it's prose. So then within prose, on the left column, there's the heading historical narrative. Should it be regarded as historical narrative? Or if not, should it be regarded as parable? That is, stories that teach truth, like Jesus' parables, stories that teach important truth, but were not intended to be thought of as history, as really capturing the events that happened. Parable from prehistory. Incidentally, you'll find some writers, scholars using what I've called parable here. They will use the term myth. The way I've described parable is basically how they're using the term myth in this context. So what should we regard it as? Historical narrative or a parable from prehistory? Continue down the right column and you'll see some of the reasons that some individuals are inclined to think of it as parable or myth. First of all, we find mixed into this material what are known as etiologies. Etiologies. These are accounts that give answer to basic questions. For example, where did rain come from? Well, we have the flood account, and there's the explanation that there didn't used to be rain originally, but then rain came initially with the flood. Why do we have rainbows? Well, there's an account of this as a sign of a covenant, and that's how rainbows, that's what they mean, and that's how they came into being. That's an etiology. Why is it that we're permitted to eat meat? After the flood, God authorized that humans may include meat in their diet. So that answers a question, why do we eat meat? Where did a variety of languages come from? Why cannot we all understand each other and speak the same language? The answer to that comes from the Tower of Babel account. So some say, because there are so many etiologies in this material, that inclines them to think that it's probably designed as parable, not as more straightforward history. Another reason is, and we'll discuss this a bit more later, the fact that there is in extra-biblical material an account known as the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells of a flood. It's a Mesopotamian account of an ancient flood, and there is a figure who, like Noah, built a boat, and as the flood was beginning to recede, he sent forth a couple of birds like Noah did. And so some suggest that since that extra-biblical account exists, well, that one probably would not be historical, and so corresponding material in the Bible is not historical in a simple sense. So it's probably myth, and so regard the whole material as parable from prehistory. That's how that line of reasoning goes. And finally, another element in that way of thinking is noticing that from time to time, God is described in anthropomorphic fashion. That is to say, God displays capabilities and features which are associated with humans. So, for example, when a sacrifice is offered by Noah after the flood, it's said that he smelled the aroma of the sacrifice. That's an anthropomorphic trait. In plain speech, God does not have a nose. He's a spirit. And so when the writer attributes to God anthropomorphic features, that becomes part of the constellation, inclining some to say, well, this is not to be understood in a straightforward fashion as an ancient account of history, but rather a parable. Similarly, in the Tower of Babel, it says that God came down. Well, that almost looks like God has to actually transverse space, territory, in order to arrive on a destination. Is that really a feature that would be limiting God? Is he limited to space? So he actually has to travel over and show up somewhere and come down from a higher realm. Again, some have regarded this as anthropomorphic speech, and consequently a contributor to the thinking that this material is parable from prehistory. And now let's consider the column historical narrative. It's been observed that as we move from the Genesis 1 to 11 material into the account of Adam, what's regarded as the historical period, it's fairly seamless. The writers don't draw a line and say, all right, now it's the end of myth, end of parable, and now we're starting a real account of history. It's seamless, and so perhaps we are not to perceive the earlier material as all that much different in its intended presentation. When we come to the New Testament, there is reference to Noah as being a historical figure. So Noah, within the prehistory area, that is to say Genesis 1 to 11, and yet New Testament writers seem to regard him as historic. They seem to be comfortable with that, and perhaps we should as well. Another component is the fact that when we come to genealogies in the New Testament, and here think of the first chapter of Matthew, we encounter some names in those genealogies that issue from the Genesis 1 to 11 material, and they are rolled out for us in a seamless fashion as legitimate ancestors to later individuals that we would regard as clearly historical. Now, regarding the Epic of Gilgamesh, an extra-biblical memory of a flood, we may want to consider that simply the fact that other cultures remember a flood should not be regarded necessarily as evidence that the biblical account did not happen. Perhaps the Babylonian or Mesopotamian memory of a flood is connected to the memory of an actual flood recorded in Scripture. And we have, regarding the Tower of Babel, the fact that ancient towers have been discovered. I'm not saying we found the Tower of Babel of Genesis 11, but indeed they have discovered ziggurats, as they're known, in Mesopotamia, so that this account is not all that far-fetched. People joining forces in order to build a large edifice of that sort. The purpose of this particular slide then is to train us in critical thinking, so that we want to carefully reflect on the biblical material as we have it. We also want to carefully reflect on the opinions of different persons as they approach that material and say, here's what I think it represents. If someone purports it to be parable from prehistory, we want to critically reflect on those claims. If someone purports it to be historical narrative, we want to critically reflect on those claims and then weigh the evidence. This concludes our survey of literary features in the passages spanning Genesis 2, especially through 10, and next we'll turn to historic features.